Good afternoon and welcome to the Western Marble Arch Synagogue here in central London. Just wanted to show you the really beautiful synagogue that we have around here. I'm standing right in the middle of the shul. It's a great place for Wi-Fi first of all, but not on Shabbat. And we have this amazing synagogue around us, be with the ark and all of these beautiful stained glass windows around in the eaves, in the what we call the cloisters at the back, the very back of the synagogue. Beautiful windows, each one depicting an aspect of Jewish life or of the Tanakh, of the Bible, and it really is a lovely place. So I like to stand here where we often broadcast. We broadcast every single day, Shacharit, and also get a chance to teach from the same place. It's something wonderful to be able to teach from the middle of a shul. I think it's what a shul is for, not just for prayer, but for education, for community, for so many other things. Behind me upstairs are these beautiful stained glass windows as well, and they also depict aspects of the year, whether it's the festivals or the Tanakh, and it's a wonderful way to be inspired while we're davening, learning, and occasionally chatting to our friends, but obviously that would never happen in the shul. So why am I going into this idea about what we do in a shul and education and discussion? I think that these elements are really important, and they in fact form the basis of the idea of Pesach. Pesach is two festivals in one, believe it or not. One is known as Chag HaMatzot, one is a festival of the Matzot, and one is Chag HaPesach. It is the festival of bringing the Korban Pesach. So there are in fact two parallel festivals described in the Torah, covering the same time frame. The Chag HaPesach is 1 day, the Chag HaMatzot is 7 days. Shivat Yamim Tochlu Matzot, for 7 days you should eat matzot, and that again shows us two aspects of the festival. So already Pesach itself has innate nuance that relates in two different areas. One, of course, being the festival and the Korban Pesach, the night itself, we're going to discuss in a moment, of the bringing the Korban Pesach, eating the Korban Pesach, the Leil HaSeder, the Haggadah, which was evolved and it became pretty much formalized in the much later in time, a number of centuries into what we call the Common Era. And the other wonderful part about the Haggadah is that we don't know who wrote the Haggadah. It is broadly anonymous in authorship. And that to me is also a wonderful aspect of Pesach itself, in that the Haggadah, which we have received over the course of the generations, has been put together in a way that tells us that it's not interesting or not important who specifically wrote it, but the fact that it's trying to address a number of really interesting issues. So the question is, what is the Haggadah about? Is it just the story of the Jewish people? Is it the story told of Exodus? Is it a discussion paper? Is it a basis for a conversation? Or is it really what I think one of the most phenomenal aspects of our educational material that we have? It is an incredible study in how to educate. And one of the studies which the Haggadah teaches us, really, I think, is the Manishtana, which we're not going to discuss in depth, but just to give you an idea. 4 questions, which people can sing in so many different languages. My dad, last night, unbeknownst to me, because he's never really done it before, he just started reciting the Manishtana in Yiddish. He said, because that's what he learned when he was a kid. And I really, in all my years, can't remember him doing that. Maybe it's aspects of his memory are becoming more accessible to him, while other aspects less so. But that, to me, was really interesting. So languages and the Manishtana. We ask 4 basic questions. And the question I have for you, basically, is how many of those questions do we answer during the Seder? We have 4 questions. Whether we eat chametz or matzah, whether we dip our vegetables once or twice, whether we have all sorts of vegetables with just maror, and whether we sit up or we lean to the side, and exactly what we do. And we assume we've asked 4 questions. It's an educational material. It's an educational evening. Surely we expect 4 answers. The answer is that there is not a single answer given in the Haggadah to these 4 questions. So that already should start to pique your interest. We've asked 4 questions, we get no answers, and yet we're very happy. No one seems to be bothered by the fact that the Manishtana is not properly answered. And I think the Manishtana is beautifully answered, because the idea of the evening is to ask questions, and the answers themselves are part of an ongoing discussion that we've been having for thousands of years. So the Haggadah has different aspects and different elements to it, and part of that is to try and encourage us to get into a conversation. The conversation needs to be about our existence, about our history. What's beautiful, again, is that the verses that are used in the Haggadah, if you look through them, by and large, the sources, the documentary sources that we use, the verses that describe the Exodus, are not from Exodus. They're from Deuteronomy. In other words, the best part of the Haggadah is the fact that it's not the original story. It's the original telling of the original story. So what you get to see again on Seder night is that the whole purpose of the Haggadah is to teach you how to tell a story. And the best way to do that is to look at the people not to whom the story happened, which is interesting. But in this particular case, it's to listen to the people who first told the story. Now, I'm going to divert a little bit, and then we'll get into the four sons, which is the main focus of what I wanted to talk about today. But when we talk about history, and we talk about documentary evidence, we talk about hearing the story, which was going to make sense, we would assume, like we do in Holocaust history, that we're coming to the end of the generation of those who can speak of their personal experiences and traumas during the Holocaust. And one of the things that Holocaust educators around the world are grappling with is the idea that we won't very soon have access to those original testimonies from people who themselves came through Europe in order to continue their lives, especially when they're talking about those members of their family and their community who did not make it out of the Holocaust. And we talk so much about what will be after they are no longer here to tell the story. It makes us very, very anxious and worried. And in fact, all of the large Holocaust organizations and small are trying to figure out ways to make sure the story stays relevant. And each one in turn is trying to find a way to get generations after the Holocaust to take the story on personally, to feel a personal sense of connection so they can transmit and they can pass on all of these experiences to further generations. And my sense is that on the one hand, it is a challenge, but on the other hand, we should feel reassured that we have been telling someone else's story, which is also our story, for the last 3,300 years. And even before that, if we go before Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah in the year 2448 of our Jewish counting, we're now in 5782, so that's 3,300 years and change, we've been telling the story and making sure that we can connect our people in our generation and the next generation to the story that happened to our forefathers and foremothers and all of our ancestors. One of the beautiful midrashim that says is that we were all present at Sinai. All souls were there at that moment. So in a sense, we're not telling someone else's story, we're telling our story. And if we were present at Sinai, then because it was only a few weeks after we'd come out of Egypt, surely we could say we were also present in Egypt. And if that's the case, that's an interesting thing to think about. We're not telling someone else's story at all. This is our story. And that's the line, Chayav Adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. This is the beautiful line that every person, b'chol dor v'dor, every generation, a person should see themselves as if they personally came out of Egypt. And how do we do that? The best way is to find a basis for a text or for a discussion that will help everybody to feel included. And I think that really, to me, is where the story of the four sons comes in. So let's spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about that. If you have any comments, please put them in the comments section if you're watching this. And as a result of that, we'll go back just before the end. We'll have a quick look at the comments that come up, and anything that I say that has piqued your interest or raised a question, please do. We'll do our best to have a stab at those questions towards the end. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen, and then we're going to have a look at the text inside of the four sons. And I want to try and present to you a theory that we've got a lot more in the text that's buried there than we'd originally have seen. And not just the words that are said, but the entire context of that section of the Haggadah altogether. So let's have a quick look. We're going to do some magic here with our technology, and we'll find a new screen to look at. And hopefully you should see this on your screen. If you can see the screen itself, you'll see that we're using Sefaria. So first of all, something to tell you all, our dear viewers, is if you have not used this program or this website, it is absolutely extraordinary. Sefaria.org, which you can see over here, is the basic name of the website, and it has tens of thousands of texts, many of them already translated. When it comes to the Tanakh, there are 22 extant translations of the Tanakh available, and you can pull whichever one you want, and that, to me, is fantastic to see which ones are incorporated, whether it's the JPS version, whether it's the Koren version, whether it's other translations. It's interesting to see how people have tried to translate the words, but ultimately we want to try and go back to the original. And here we're going to be reading the Haggadah specifically in Hebrew and in English. So we'll look at a few elements of these words, and we're going to see exactly where we go with this. So we're into Magid, and if I was to scroll a little bit further back, we've come out of a couple of stories from the four questions. So we have the four questions here, Manishtana. After the Manishtana is completed, we go into the idea of Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves in Egypt, and if you were in shul on Shabbat afternoon just passed a few days ago, we actually read in the Ashkenazi tradition from this part, Avadim Hayinu, to the very end of Dayenu, which is that great poem that we read about all the things we're grateful for that God has done for us. So that's the next paragraph. After Avadim Hayinu, we have a great story about the 5 rabbis sitting around a table in Bnei Brak, and they're discussing the Seder all night long. And this, again, is another aspect of showing you that even people who, in their own right, each of these rabbis is a community leader, a renowned sage, scholar in the Jewish people. Nevertheless, the 5 of them get together, and they still discuss the nuances of the Exodus all night long. So it's giving us an example of even people who you might feel, well, they know it all, they've discussed it all. Nevertheless, the example and the opportunity for them to sit down and discuss this issue is fascinating. And once we get through that, we have another idea of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says, I'm like 70 years old. I'm like a man of 70. It's that because he was 18 years old when he was selected to be the head of the Sanhedrin. And as a result of that, he went to bed and he was worried that he wouldn't look distinguished enough to be a leader of a community. And overnight, he, as it were, his hair turned gray, white. He woke up in the morning, and according to the wonderful story, he now presents himself. Though he looks young, he has a very, very distinguished look about him, and therefore he's taken more seriously. Something in our society which we can reference. Somebody who has that old age and that experience has a lot more to tell us often than younger people who are still on their way to finding out about life. And then we get to this idea of the 4 sons. And it doesn't start with the name of the sons. It starts with this interesting introduction. Baruch hamakom baruch hu. Blessed be Hashem. Blessed be God. Blessed is He. Now, why is the word makom used for Hashem? In other words, we could say Baruch Hashem baruch hu. Baruch Elokim baruch hu. But yet we say this word makom. And makom, as we know, means blessed be the place. Right? God's name is called place. And the question is why? And there are 2 times in our Jewish year, and I've had, sadly, a lot of opportunities to say this at various shivas and levayos over the last couple of years, especially as we come through this pandemic, is there are 2 times in the year where we use the word makom for God's name. The first one, as you see here, is in the Haggadah, and we use it before we get into the discussion of the 4 sons. The other time we hear the word makom is when we're at a shiva. And the last concluding line of comfort that we say to the mourners is Hamakom Yinachem Etchem. May God comfort you. And God as Makom. And what I'd like to posit, first of all, is the word Makom is God's name when we are in transition or in transit. If we are in a place where we're not sure where we are, or we're going to a place we haven't been to before, or we're uncertain, the word Makom is the most appropriate name to use for God. Because God is effectively telling us that while we are finding our place in this new world, this new uncharted territory, God comes to us as a place. He comes to us with his attribute of place, of certainty, of context. And therefore, when we are, as it were, navigating these uncharted waters, at least God is with us, as it were, holding our hand, lifting us up, giving us guidance, so that we don't have to feel so afraid about the things we have not yet discovered. So when it comes to the idea of an educational journey, we're going to be going on a journey, we need to be open-minded. And we need to be so open-minded to the possibilities that we need God to come to us with that reassurance that even if we veer off our normal beaten track of thought and analysis, we don't have to worry because God is with us as we make our way through this world. So that's an interesting idea of the word makom. So we start with the 4 sons, the idea of the 4 sons, with this opening discussion or this opening declaration that it is God in his attribute of place that is going to help us through this next section. And we then say, Baruch Shnatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael. The second premise is not just that God is there to help us with our uncertainty, but God, in fact, has given us a guide, the Torah, a guide to life, a guide to an approach, a guide to how to engage with the world. Baruch Hu. God should be blessed for these 2 things alone, certainty and the Torah. So once we have those 2 aspects in place, we're ready for a proper discussion. And the discussion goes like this. There are 4 sons about which the Torah discusses or talks. We would expect to see the word al arba banim dibra Torah, about four sons the Torah discusses or speaks, but it uses the word keneged. Keneged to me is fascinating because it means against. So the translation here is corresponding to, which is colloquial. But if you're looking at the absolute pure translation of the word neged, neged means against. Negadim are antibodies. They are things that are against viruses in our body. So keneged arba banim dibra Torah. Maybe this phrase means not just corresponding to, but in contrast or in difference to specifically the four sons the Torah speaks. In other words, don't assume that the four sons is the only way to define what you're looking at. The Torah wants to show you in four ways how there are different approaches to a particular subject. But keneged should, as it were, alert you to the notion that it's not simple to discuss four sons. There are 4 points of contention we're going to have to deal with in order to understand fully what they're about to say to us. Who are the four sons that we're talking about in this particular educational example? Echad Chacham, one is the, let's say, the wise son. Echad Rasha, and one is the wicked son, and we'll discuss what that means again. Echad Tam, and one is, well, translated as simple or innocent. Nice word here, innocent. It's a very nice translation, actually, for what we're about to say. Ve'echad she'eno yodea lish'ol, and there is one son who doesn't know how to ask, doesn't know how to engage in the conversation. So let's have a quick look at the 4 approaches which we are being presented with in this particular example, and then we're going to come back and have a review of exactly what this might be telling us. And I think it's going to be an interesting approach, which you can take to your Seder tables as well, and I'm sure will spark some interesting debate. So the Chacham, we're going to briefly go through these. I know that people talk about the 4 sons. You may have heard ideas, and the translation will do justice to the words themselves, but I'm looking at a more holistic view of these 4 individuals. Chacham Uomer, what does the Chacham say, the intelligent son? Ma ha'edot va'chukim va'mishpatim asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. What are these particular types of words? Firstly, there's statutes or testimonies, edut. Hachukim, these are statutes or laws which we don't necessarily fully understand, but we keep because God said so. Va'mishpatim, and those are the classic standard legal codes which we could probably determine, as the Torah says, if we just followed logic. Don't do this because this is detrimental. It would be logically arrived at. It wouldn't need to be spoken. So these are 3 different aspects, and the Chacham is showing us, look at me, in that sense. I know that there is nuance to what I'm asking. It's not just what is this, but these 3 aspects are different ways of looking at this subject. I'm quite intelligent, knowledgeable, and I want to show you that through my question, I've got a lot to say, and then the answer back to the Chacham is to take him on a different journey. It says, and what you say is, Va'afata omer lo, and even you should say to him. It doesn't say Va'ata omer lo, you should say to him, Va'af, which means, and you should even or appropriately say to him. It also means that just because he's coming to you with, as it were, all the answers, after all, he is a, as they'd say in Yiddish, a chuchen, right? He knows everything there is to know. Even for someone who knows everything there is to know, Va'af, even then, Atal omer lo ki hilchot Pesach. You should start to explain to him some of the nuances of the halacha, of the strict halachic discussion, the legal discussions around what you're supposed to do, and you tell him basically, that's all very nice, which is important, but you can't eat anything after the afikoman. Once you finish that, there's nothing more to eat. Seems a bit arbitrary, seems a bit of a shutdown, right? Somebody asks an intelligent question, you're like, that's very nice, don't eat anything after midnight, right? So, or halachic midnight, let's put it that way. So that's not really quite a satisfactory response, and the Haggadah seems to be happy with that. So keep that in mind. A very intelligent question with a very short, sharp answer, and that's the end of that. First son. Second son, Rasha, Mahu Omer. What does the second son say? And he's the wicked son. Let's see what he has to say. He says, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. What is all this work to you? And the Haggadah goes specifically and takes umbrage with this word lachem. What do you mean you? And basically it says to him, you know what? You means it's not the person who's asking. He's like, what about you lot? What do you lot think of all of this? It's a very, very disjointed, it's an angry, actually, it's a very unhappy position to be in. He's not interested, doesn't talk to him. He's sitting at the table or he's doing this. And he's like, you know what? What's this all about? I'm just not interested. And then we get into a really quite a sharp discussion. So in what would not normally be called 21st century parenting, you basically tell him he's an absolute disgrace. Kafar be'ikar, he has actually completely and utterly denied the basic principles of all of our existence as Jews. V'afata hakeh chinav, and more than that, you should hakeh chinav, which literally means you should basically smash his face in, punch him in the face. Hakeh, which means to blunt, it's shinav, his teeth. But the word shinav is beautiful because it has etymological connections to shinaim, which are teeth. It also has from the word vashinantam, and you should teach in a way that becomes sharp and knowledgeable. And also from the word shinui, meaning a change. So we've got three aspects, teeth and knowledge and change. So what basically this is saying beautifully and homiletically is give him a wake-up call. In other words, sort of a slap around the face, as it were, a fruskin pisk, as they might say in the old country. And the idea is to not just break his teeth, but break his mode of thinking. Don't be so negative. Don't be such an outsider. I want to literally break you in. I want to bring you here. I want to change your view. And what I'm saying is it's because of this that God did to me when I left Egypt. It's me, because I feel like an insider. But you, if you were there, you wouldn't have been redeemed. In other words, your attitude would never have got you out of Egypt. And that's what he's trying to say. Don't be so pig-headed, or don't be so anyway-headed. Just be more open to the questions that are being asked. Fascinating answer. Number 3, Tam. The simple son, or the innocent son. Mahu omer, what does he say? Mazot. What is this? No qualifiers, no knowledge, no expansion, just a simple, straightforward question. And therefore, for him, it doesn't say va'af amarte lav. You don't need to be confrontational. You don't need to say, and on top of that, I need to tell you something. Va'amarte lav. And you should just say to him, b'chozek yad hotzienu Hashem mitzrayim mibeit avadim. God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. Isn't that wonderful? In other words, start him with a miracle of wonder. Just tell him that this is what happened. God did wonderful things, took us out of Egypt. Isn't it a great story? And start him on the path of wonder. Tam doesn't just mean simple, as it's sometimes described. It's innocent or it's naive in a form of like childlike innocence. Just a very simple way to look at things. So we assume little kid at the table, just saying, what's all this? And so you start him on a wonderful question, or her. And the last part here, is the child who doesn't know, or the person at the table, and not necessarily a child, right? Because you could have a 95-year-old father with his 75-year-old son sitting next to him, who could also be She'enu Yodea Lishol, and it can, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. The Torah, by default, writes in a generic masculine, but it doesn't necessarily mean just to the men, unless the mitzvot are describing specifically things are related to men. So let's go more generically. And someone who doesn't know how to ask a question, at patach lo, you have to open for him. At, by the way, if it's Aramaic, could also be masculine, but in modern Hebrew, at is feminine, but then it would be patchalo. But at patachlo basically means you open it for him. Very simple. And you say, you have to tell your son on that day, because of what Hashem did, he took me out of Egypt. This is the same as the answer for the previous son, right? This is the answer for the Rasha. Remember, he took the word li and said li means to me, and you as the wicked son, you're outside of that circle. But the same answer is given to the person who doesn't know how to ask a question. And the reason why the same is used is because of the first part. You should tell your children. In other words, this is how you start the conversation. Because God took me out of Egypt and did this for me in Egypt, that's why we have questions to ask. Great. So now we have our 4 sons, and we've asked them 4 children, and we've asked their questions. I'd like to posit the following. There aren't 4 sons here. There's only one. The one child who's asking, or the one person who's asking these questions, comes at life in 4 different ways. The first is chacham. There are many aspects of life we come at with knowledge. If we are a lawyer, we have knowledge of law. If we're a doctor, we have knowledge of medicine. If we're an artist, we have knowledge of light and color and shade and hues and context and environment. All of these things are our chokhmah, our knowledge and our intelligence. And once we ask a question with intelligence, it's not just a simple question. What does that painting say? What's this beautiful, as I said, stained glass window doing behind me? But how did they get those nuances of color and hue and light and dark and thickness and opacity in that glass. And by saying that, you're showing just in the knowledge of what you're doing that you have a lot to say. But in the same time, when you're responding, you have to say, you know what? There are times when knowledge is wonderful, but if you feel you have all the knowledge, you don't have an ability to be open to other things you may not know yet. So the chacham, who's chacham in one particular area of life, may actually be closed off from new ideas, from new understandings, because it comes with a sense of sometimes a superiority, that there's nothing you can teach me. That is not the idea of the Seder. Everybody has something to learn from everyone, regardless of who they are. Surely the previous paragraph of the 5 great rabbis would tell you, it doesn't matter how great you are, there's always a chance to learn. And therefore, to bring someone down to earth, you say, you know what? There's a nuanced of tiny halacha that you need to know on top of all of your great, great knowledge. Just know, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how smart or how unsmart you are, when it comes to midnight, everything's done and we have to move on. Very nice. The Rasha, this one is for me, the most exciting, because the Rasha is not a wicked person. I think the Rasha is someone who is agitated, who's angry, who for some reason feels a sense of rejection in some parts of life. A person who's come through an experience that has left them marred or bitter or resentful. And that resentment comes up in a form of disengagement, a form of an outsider. You know what? It's all for you. What does this mean to you? And when he says to you, he's saying is, I don't feel any part of this. I'm not interested. I couldn't care less. And I'm just throwaway. And the Haggadah and the idea of the Seder is to bring him back. And sometimes there's time for a nice, sweet conversation. But at certain times, people need to be shaken out of their stupor, as it were, of not feeling that they are inside. And what the Haggadah and the Seder is trying to say, I don't care how far away you think you are. I don't care how far you feel you've drifted or how far you are resentful of what it is. There's something quite magical about having a chance to share our story. And therefore, I don't have time, as it were, to get into a long conversation at this point. I need to wake you up, shake you up, break your teeth in a metaphorical sense and tell you, this is how it goes. If this was your attitude then, you'd be in serious trouble. And by the way, if this is your attitude now, you're still in serious trouble. You need Mr. Rasha, son, for that particular moment, to give me the trust that even though you're not where you're supposed to be, you're angry, you're resentful, you're bitter, and you're sad about this, give me a chance to open up the conversation. And once we open up the conversation, your Rasha-ness for that particular subject may veer into one of the other aspects, either knowledge, or we're going to see the other two. So what is Tam? It's always seen as someone simple. I don't think Tam is simple. I think Tam is the most intelligent son, or the intelligent aspect at the table. But because of an intelligence and a humility, it comes across as simple or innocent. I think there's incredible knowledge in this Tam individual, or Tam characteristic, because it means you can just open up with an open question. Mazot, what are we doing? What is this all about? How are we going to fathom what comes next? And because of that, you can start with the great grandiose idea. God, with a great outstretched arm, brought us out of Egypt. And that's how we're going to start this conversation, out of the house of slavery. It's slavery which is the problem. Beit Avadim is where you feel enslaved to an idea or an ideology or a concept that won't let you leave. The Tam is the response to that. Tam is a simplicity, a wide-eyed wonder that allows you to ask any question and be open to any answer. The final, I think, is She'enu L'Yodea Lish'ol. How many times in our life, whether it's in Jewish life, in secular life, in professional life, in personal life, we don't even know where to begin. We don't know what the questions are. We don't know what's bothering us. If we go into a therapy session, you'll sit down with a therapist and start talking, and what you're talking about is usually largely irrelevant from what's really bothering you, because all of us need to get to the moment where we really are in pain or finding challenge. And that takes time. So when you're not sure what you're supposed to say or where you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to respond, at B'tachla, somebody else needs to start the conversation for you. The She'eno Yodea Lish'ol is every single one of us at least once, if not many more times in our life. And I would hazard to say, on a daily basis, we are in a mode or a mindset of She'eno Yodea Lish'ol. I don't know what's flying. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. And we can think about anxiety or depression as modern interpretations of this particular nuance. So somebody else needs to help you. So this tells you that whatever happens, however difficult it is, or where you don't know where to start with the questions, find somebody or have someone look out for you to find that person and get them talking. Just get them talking. And then they'll be able to do that. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to have a quick look if there are any comments. I have just one. And what I'm saying is that that is the 4 sons. There is a 5th son. And this is an idea that the Lubavitcher Rebbe talks about. It's an idea I heard from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin in Efrat and many people. The idea is that there is a 5th son who doesn't even figure at the Seder table. He's not there, not available, not too intelligent, not angry, not wide-eyed wonder, and not, as it were, a little bit without questions. They're not even available and not even at the Seder. And our job in life in general, and in the Seder in particular, and in Judaism in particular, is to go out and find that 5th son and get them to the table so they get a chance to be one of the other 4 characteristics. Is it 4 sons? Well, it's presented that way. I think, and in a modern context, I think this is a reading which would fit our generation very well. It's an individual person who is coming at life in 4 different ways: knowledge, resentment, wide-eyed wonder, and a sense of disorientation. And if we look at our own lives, we will find many places where we are exhibiting one or more of those sentiments. And if we read the Haggadah this year, we have a look at this. Why don't you ask the people at your Seder table to tell you or share this theory? How many sons are there? And they may say none, or they may say 4. And when you come back to them and say, I think there's one person at this table in 4 different states of mind. And that, I think, will be a fascinating conversation, a fascinating discussion for this year. 2022, 5782, it's not been an easy year. It's still not an easy year. We're out of a major sense of COVID, but nevertheless, we're still being careful. There are wars being fought. There is uncertainty in Russia, Ukraine, and further east and further west as well. And all of these things tell us that we have to be on guard and open to possibilities, to being especially careful to take care of those around us and to make sure we have a wonderful Pesach and understand what it is about. Please God, for everybody who's watching and to your families, you should have a Chag Pesach Kasher v'Sameach. And why do we say, actually, it should be Chag Sameach v'Kasher for Pesach. Why do we say Sameach before Kasher? Because we know it's going to be Kasher. That's all we do. We plan and we buy and we clean and we scrub. But usually we're so exhausted from all of the cleaning, we don't have any simcha left. So for Pesach, you should say Chag Sameach v'Kasher. Have a wonderful, happy, enjoyable, and kosher Pesach wherever you are. Chag Sameach.